Hey there, continuing through Revelation, we are looking at Revelation 12. The goal for us on Saturday night was that we would go through 12 and 13, but that did not happen. So we're just doing 12 tonight, looking at the woman and the dragon is what my Bible little what is it called, subtitle says. So just kind of recapping, we're entering the second half of the book. We just wrapped up the seals and the trumpets and these judgments that flow out of the throne room scene in Revelation 4 and 5. And now we're entering into like a new series of visions here. Revelation 12, 14, this whole section here. It is the center of the book, and it has some significant kind of symbols moving forward. So pretty pivotal understanding what's going on with the rest of the book. So yeah, let's just jump into Revelation 12, and then we'll talk about how we're going to maybe interpret the second half of this passage. So it first says, verse 1, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and agony of giving birth." So we have a woman. She's described a lot like Joseph is described in his dreams in Genesis, and she's pregnant giving birth. So then that's happening over here. And then another sign appeared, verse 3, in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them down to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child who was to rule over the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, in which she was nourished for 1,260 days. So we have this woman who's about to give birth, who identified kind of with Joseph, kind of patriarch sounding. And then we have this dragon that appears, who is waiting to devour the child when it was born. So this dragon, I think, is pretty clearly, right, this is a kind of Satan figure, right, pursuing the woman, and later, is directly called like the accuser here later, the accuser of the brethren. It's kind of no doubt kind of who that character is. But the mother here, or the woman, there are a lot of views maybe what that could represent. And I think the best view here is an understanding that she is representative of the people of God. So of the people of God throughout like salvation history, meaning, so right here she's pregnant, she's about to give birth. There's this anticipation, this groaning, until, right, we see kind of an image of the Messiah being born and Jesus being born and Jesus coming out of the people of God. So if we understand this woman as kind of the people of God, it also makes sense of this number that we've seen in the past, 1,260 days. If we remember from chapter 11, that 1,260 days is the length of time that we're told that the people of God are going to preach, and they're going to proclaim kind of God's word, but they're also going to be vulnerable to possible persecution, and it's kind of this tension between preaching in the midst of this tough time, this persecution and tribulation. So here, the image is of the woman fleeing and being nourished in the wilderness. So very similar to the same kind of language we have in chapter 11, that you're in the wilderness, you're being persecuted, but God is bringing you through in these 1,260 days. So if we have the timeline here is that Satan is pursuing the woman, but the child is born who's going to rule the nations and is called up to God. This seems to be talking about Jesus' birth, Jesus' life, and his ascension when he leaves. And when he leaves, we got to talk about this, but the other 1260 days, it's kind of the time between Jesus and his second coming. So I think that makes sense of the story. If we're talking about the church being nourished in the wilderness and being preserved through persecution in the time after Jesus leaves. We also see, so verse 4, I kind of skipped that, but the tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven. This is one of the verses where you get the idea that that Satan, there's this pre-Genesis 1 type of situation where Satan falls and Satan brings a third of the angels with him. We've seen stars be representative of angels already throughout Revelation. So I think that's the big story here in verse 1 through 6. People of God are pursued by the devil. Jesus comes, the one who would rule. Jesus ascends, and God nourishes his people in the wilderness as the devil continues to pursue them. So now I think that's 1 through 6, and I think the rest of the chapter is using different language and different images to talk about the same exact story. So I think verse 7 through 17 are now going to retell verse 1 through 6, but in a different way, in a metaphor of an army, in the same way that the people of God and overcome kind of in the first little section here, 1 through 6. We don't get a lot of picture in that little section explaining Jesus and explaining how he defeats the devil. So it gives a little more detail on maybe what it means when we say that this is the ruler who will rule all the nations with the rod of iron. So when we get into it, I'll point out kind of why I think that. But the first big reason, I'll just show you if you jump to 12:14. So before we get into any of the story, I'm just jumping ahead where we talk about the woman again. And it says that the woman was given 2 wings with a great eagle so she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, so just like we saw, to a place where she's nourished for a time and times and time, or in half a time. And that times and times and half a time is a phrase to mean pretty much the same amount of time that we've seen 1260 days, 42 months. So same time where the woman is fleeing from the serpent, is nourished in the wilderness for that amount of time, is mentioned in verse 14. So we're rehashing some of the same stuff. So in this case, first we see an image. So that's 1 through 6, and then we're going to retell that story here in the image of a war. So let's look at verse 7. Now war rose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, right? So that's who the dragon is. The deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and the angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night. So we see this army, Michael's fighting the devil. The armies are fighting, and it says that he was thrown down, that he was conquered. That the accuser was conquered here. We know, we've already seen it in chapter 5, when the Lamb conquers. How does he conquer? Through his blood, through his self-giving sacrifice, his loving sacrifice for us. So when we talk here about, when we talk about the devil being kind of thrown down. This is kind of metaphorical language, this warfare language, to really talk about the work of Jesus, particularly at the cross and resurrection. So we don't go into a lot of detail here, just like we didn't go into a lot of detail, definitely in 1 through 6, to talk about it. It just says that the child was born and was called up to God. It really skips a lot in the Jesus story there. But the important thing is John didn't really need to go into all those details, but just to say that Jesus conquers, that Jesus is that Jesus is the one who conquers the devil. That's how the defeat of the devil has been brought about. And verse 11 continues to talk about the brethren and the church. And they conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. So this is a theme kind of we've seen throughout, right? That your testimony, your witness is really what Revelation is so getting at. It's about, and not so much, we were just talking about this with someone today, not so much about these future events, but about Revelation, about your current faithfulness and suffering, current faithfulness in your situation. So it's saying that the church is conquered by clinging to the cross, by the blood of the Lamb, by putting faith in the blood of the Lamb, but also by the word of their testimony, continuing to be faithful. That's how they have defeated and conquered Satan. And then it's verse 12, therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And this is the first idea we see here, that the devil has been defeated. Right? The story's not over yet, but we already hear a voice that says the devil has been thrown down, and he knows his time is short. This is the position that the devil battles from, and you can see why this would be a encouraging word for a group of persecuted believers to say that, hey, your real enemy has already been defeated and conquered, and you continue to conquer when you're faithful in your testimony and your witness. So that, if this is retelling verses kind of 1 through 6, we're really just, we've kind of retold that this woman we're kind of through the part where the woman gave birth, and this person who will rule with a rod of iron, and maybe even been caught up to heaven. So we're kind of like mostly through that, like verse 2 6. We're almost to like verse 1 through 5, because the second half of our war story says that when the dragon, verse 13, when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. So now we're rehashing this part here. That the devil is pursuing the woman. But the woman, and here's what I read earlier, but the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle, that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she's to be nourished for a time and half a time. So I'll just point out 2 images, and we're going to see some more. So 2 images that are significant here is that the woman, it says, is given wings of the great eagle. And that is language that comes from Exodus 19:18 or 19:11, I think I've written down there. But Exodus 19, it's being lifted up on the wings of eagles. We kind of hear that in some Psalms and some other, I think it's echoed in the Psalms and other points. But that's an Exodus kind of image. In the same way that wilderness is, right? That the people of God wander the wilderness because of their disobedience. So maybe not the disobedience part being a connection here, but the fact that they've escaped, or that the woman escaped and she's in the wilderness. Right? God does nourish the people of God as they get manna and they get water from the rock. So there's like imagery from Exodus just being echoed here. That's all I'm trying to point out. And we get some more in verse 15. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to help the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of its offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. So this last effort, as the woman flies away and is nourished in the wilderness, the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth to sweep this woman. And it says that the earth came to help the woman and opened its mouth and swallowed the river. And so this is more Exodus language, right? The big moment in the Exodus, the climax of that story is the passing, passing through the Red Sea, and God's people are delivered out of that. And the swallowing up language about Pharaoh's army being swallowed up. So we're kind of borrowing some of that Exodus language here. And I think a couple of reasons that's kind of important is one that remember this woman that we're seeing is representative of the people of God. So not just New Testament church post Christ, but John is connecting the story of these people who are being persecuted by the Roman government, being persecuted by also Jewish communities. And he's connecting it back to the big story of the people of God, the big story of Israel, as another way to encourage them, as another way to remind them that the promises of God are good for them too, and that God has been faithful to his people for thousands of years and will continue to be faithful. So I think that's one of the reasons why we see kind of this Exodus language. It's tying together people of God and tying his audience into the larger story. And it so wraps up, like I said, that the dragon's furious and goes off to make war with the rest of her offspring. So just like we mentioned that Satan's time is short earlier, another word of encouragement to this persecuted church is that this is more desperation from the devil. The devil was not able to conquer Jesus. The devil was not able to take out the people of God as a whole. So what the devil now does is just goes off and really can't make war on Jesus or make war on God's people as a whole. It sounds like it's kind of the image, but can only make war on certain offspring and other people here. So it is again a symbol of desperation on the devil's part, that he's been defeated. He cannot conquer Jesus, and now all he can do is really throw these things like this persecution at the believers in John's time. So quick one tonight, but that's really kind of part one. It ends with he stood on the sand of the sea, and we're going to see a beast rising out of the sea here next. So we've seen the dragon, and in the next chapter we're going to see two beasts that kind of make up this unholy false trinity that is contrasted with the true trinity of Revelation. So that's the idea of Revelation 12. We'll be back next week for 13, and those are the big points I wanted to get to. Fantastic. Appreciate you guys. All right.